school that's live in person.
They're hybrid, free country. Everybody gets to do what they want. Okay, so we're talking about the city, the story that led up to the destruction of Sodom, and you have chapter 19 in the book of Exodus, in the book of Genesis, page 85 in the stone, and the description is how Lot invites the guests, a guest which is breaking the law, and we mentioned last week that he invites them toward the evening. So the evening, he hopes that nobody's going to notice, because in the evening it's dark, nobody realizes who's walking down the street. But unfortunately, the plan falls apart. The Medrash has this whole story where the Medrash says that Lot's wife, Lot, we discussed this last week, how Lot had to do everything alone, right? If you read verse number 3 in chapter 19, it's a sort of a lonely verse, and he urged them and he urged them very much. So they turned toward him and came to his house. He made a feast for them and baked matzot, and they ate. So he's doing everything alone.
I would say yes.
No participation from his family. And you contrast that to Abraham, who, when the guests come to Abraham, it's a family event. He runs to his wife and tells Sarah to bake the bread, and ultimately and Elanar to the lad, which is Yishmael. So he's alone in this. So the Medrash says that, how did everybody find out? Because you send a husband to the kitchen, he doesn't know where anything is. So where's the salt? So he asks his wife, where's the salt? The wife runs out of salt, so you go to your neighbor. And the neighbor wants salt, so she says, oh, we have salt, we have guests. So that's the Medrash. The Medrash says that that's how the word gets out. And when the word gets out, you read verse 4, they had not yet lain down when the townspeople, Sodomites, converged upon the house from young to old, all the people from every quarter. So everybody comes around, and they want to harm, they basically want to harm the guests. Now, the commentators point out that the word Anshe Sodom, the people of Sodom, is basically highlighting Anshe, Ish. When the Torah says a man, it's a sign of importance. Like you read in yesterday's parsha, that Vayishtachu Ish el Re'ehu, man bound to his fellow, that referring to Moses and his father-in-law. So the word Ish represents prominence. So the people, the mob, is not just the common people in town, but the mob is the important people in town. Again, all this entire scene is here really to justify the destruction of Sodom, because you see that the entire city is corrupt because they outlaw kindness. And they tell Lot, verse 5, they called to Lot and they said to him, we are the men who came to you tonight. Bring them out to us, and we may know them. Know them. Rashi quotes the Medrash that says knowing is a euphemism for sexual relations. They want to basically harm them. They want to rape them. Basically, what's happening. Lot goes outside and he says, "No, we're not going to do that. You have a better plan." Verse 7 on 87, and he said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act wickedly. See now, I have 2 daughters who have never known a man. I shall bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. But to these men do nothing, inasmuch as they have come under the shelter of my roof." So he offers to give them his 2 daughters. The people say, "No, we want them," and they come to break down the door, and that's when the angels step in, and they make the mob lose sight. They smite them with sanverim, which means that they're hard for them to see. And then they tell Lot, "Well, we're destroying the entire city. Get your family, and we're leaving." And only some of his family want to leave; the rest stay, and of course get destroyed. The question becomes the fact: what's with Lot's suggestion? Lot says, "You can have my 2 daughters." Is that a good idea or a bad idea? Is that considered a moral decision or an immoral decision? So this is a very difficult question to answer, simply because he's in a difficult position. He's got a mob around his house. He wants to do something nice. He wants to protect the guests, but on the other hand, he's sacrificing his own daughters. It sounds totally strange. And in short, you look at the Medrash, and there's basically 2 opinions whether or not this was a good a good act or a bad act. I think the more common interpretation is that it was a negative act. And in fact, the Medrash makes the point that what happens to him later in the chapter, that he has relations with his own daughters, is sort of a result of the quote unquote sin that he wants to sacrifice them. So the Medrash sees this whole chapter, his response as something negative. But in any case, that's the story. And at this point, as we mentioned earlier, God tells Abraham, I'm going to go down and see whether or not to destroy the city, whether or not they have turned evil. And the commentaries pointed out, what does it mean God is going to descend? God is everywhere. So we said that God will descend means God will send the angels, and depending how the people respond to the angels, that will determine their fate. And that's why only after they come and they want to destroy the home, to destroy the door to come into the home, that's the first time in verse 12, the people tell Lot, we are destroying the city, because that's when the decision was made in response to the actions of the people of Sodom. So if you look at verse 12, then the men said to Lot, whom else do you have here? His son-in-law, your sons, or your daughters? All that you have in the city, remove from this place, for we are about to destroy this place. They only give that news. Mashchitim anachnu. We're about to destroy the city. They only say it after the mob converges on the home. Now, Lot goes and he tries to negotiate with his sons-in-law to leave. Now, according to the Medrash Rashi reads, and Rashi based on the Medrash reads verse 14, that Lot had, in addition to the two daughters, he had another two daughters who were married. And he's trying to get them to leave. They don't want to leave. They think it's a big joke. They don't believe him. Verse 14, you read the end of verse 14, but he seemed like a jester in the eyes of his sons-in-law. They didn't believe that this is going to happen. The city will be destroyed. In any case, the verse continues. 15, just as dawn was breaking, the angels urged Lot on, saying, get up, take your wife and your two daughters who are present, lest you be swept away because of the sin of the city. They basically, the verse says, still he lingered. So the men grasped him by his hand, his wife's hand, and the hand of the two daughters, and Hashem's mercy on him. And they took him out and left him outside the city. He didn't want to leave. Very hard to leave your birthplace. And it wasn't his birthplace, but the place that he was comfortable there. He didn't want to leave Sodom. Literally, the verse describes how the men hold his hand, the hand of his wife, the hand of his two daughters, and they put him outside the city. And they basically tell him, verse 17, and it was as they took him out that one said, flee for your life, do not look behind you, nor stop anywhere in all the plain, flee to the mountain, lest you be swept away. So basically, you'll be swept away. In other words, don't turn back. He has the warning not to turn back. Lot says, I don't want to go to the mountain. I want to stay in the valley. Maybe I can go to a close by city named Zoar. Angel says, fine, you can go there. And that city was called Zoar. And the Torah describes the destruction that comes from the heaven. And then we have an interesting verse 26 that we spoke about a few weeks ago. We'll mention it again quickly. His wife peered behind him and she became a pillar of salt. So his wife turns back. She is destroyed too. Okay. So that's a point. What's the problem with turning back? So we mentioned that turning back means that she really she's still concerned about what's happening in Sodom. She's still emotionally connected to Sodom. And the only way you can be saved from Sodom is if emotionally you're separated. You do Teshuva. Teshuva means I'm disconnecting myself from the negative situation. So, for example, when you talk about Teshuva, the sages explain that a very important component of Teshuva is regret. Right? If you have Teshuva without regret, it's not Teshuva. So, for example, if I did something wrong and I say, well, Teshuva has two components. It has regret for the past and resolution for the future. If I miss one of them, it's not complete Teshuva. If you think about it, if I say I hit you once and I say I'm sorry, but I'm going to do it again tomorrow, obviously that's not Teshuva, right? If you're not going to accept for the future, it's obviously not Teshuva. But what happens if I say, you know what, I'm never going to do it again, but I don't regret the past? So is that a proper teshuva? So the sages say no. You have to have an important component is regret for the past. Why? Just because we want you to feel guilty for what you did? The answer is no. The answer is when a person sins, you invest the most important part of you in the sin. What's the most important part of you? Your soul. In other words, in the words of the Kabbalah, your pleasure. Your pleasure is the most important part of you. It reaches the deepest part of you. So if I do something wrong and I enjoy it, now I have to regret it. What does regret mean? Regret means now I'm extracting my pleasure from that event. If I regret it, then I'm pulling myself out. If I never regretted it, then my pleasure is still invested in there. So I'm still connected to the sin. Similarly here, who gets saved from Sodom? The people who want to disconnect from Sodom and never turn back. Never turn back is not just a physical orientation, but it's that emotionally we're disconnected. We cut our ties to the lifestyle of Sodom. But Lot's wife can't do so. She is from Sodom. Remember, Lot arrived to Sodom as a immigrant. He was from Abraham's family, and he came from Ur Kasdim, came to Israel, lived on the mountain with Abraham, and then goes to Sodom. But his wife is a native, so she doesn't want to. She cannot disconnect herself from Sodom, and therefore she too is punished. And it's interesting, we mentioned this in the past, that you see this with the Jewish people also. When the Jewish people left Egypt, you see a similar pattern. They keep turning back to Egypt. They keep saying, we want to go back to Egypt. And because they want to go back to Egypt, some say that's why they can't go into Israel. And only the next generation goes into Israel. So this idea of just because you left the place, are you still turning back, happens in Sodom, but it also happens in the next book, in the book of Exodus, with the Jewish people in general. Okay, so we continue. And then, go ahead, yes.
Question and comment. So I guess 19:4 gives birth to the term sodomy, the meaning of language.
Yes.
A derivative of Sodom.
Yes. But it's interesting that in Jewish culture, that wasn't what makes sodomy, what's considered the essential sin of Sodom is not homosexuality, but holding back and not supporting the poor. Right. So that's interesting that even though that in English it becomes a different, it means something else. But
the question I had is that she became a pillar of salt.
Yeah.
But salt in and of itself has a special significance in Judaism, correct?
Yeah. So salt is fascinating. Salt is the idea that we always put salt in all the offerings. And that's why we put salt on our bread, because now when we don't have the temple, the salt is considered, the table a person eats is considered as the altar. And therefore, just like there's a verse that says you have to have salt on all of your offerings, so we therefore have salt on our bread. So we'll get to that in the third book. But before we even do that, what's the characteristic of salt? So go ahead. A preservative. Is preservative good? Is it good to preserve? Definitely. Well, the short answer is John, you know this by now. The answer is always it depends, Jonathan. The answer is always it depends. So when you want, what the Torah describes land that's going to be destroyed and not be able to grow. Torah refers to as Eretz Milecha, a salted land. Right? If you put salt on your field, you preserve the nutrients and nothing can grow. Because for something to grow, you have to have the cycle of life where the seed is going to rot, it's going to germinate, and the rotting allows for regrowth. That's the cycle of life. If you salt the field, then nothing is going to grow. Why? Because everything is stuck. Everything is preserved. So preservation is nice if you want to preserve something, but if you want growth, it's not going to happen. Okay. Now, why do we put salt on the temple food? So there are different commentaries, but one commentary is because we want to preserve the inspiration. Right? You go to the temple, you bring an offering. We don't want it to be a one-time inspiration. Right? I go to the temple on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. I'm inspired, but then I go home and I lose that inspiration. So the verse says no. The verse says if you're coming to the temple, you have to preserve the meat. You have to eat it with salt, which represents preservation, because the message over here is that you don't come to the temple to have a one-time experience. The point is, could you preserve? The challenge is to preserve, the obligation is to preserve that inspiration and take it home with you. Okay. But when it comes to growth, you don't want to be stuck. And what's happened with the wife of Lot represents the fact he becomes a pillar of salt. In a spiritual sense, she's not able to grow. She's not able to evolve into something new. And evolving into something new requires sometimes that your current state to rot. In other words, there's loss, there's terrible loss here, right? Lot has to start his life again, okay? So you're losing something, but you're starting something new. You could look at it as destruction. You could look at it as birth. You could look at the seed. It's rotting, but that allows for, that's the process of life. When the old self rots, the new self could emerge. But when a person is stuck in their ways, and that represents Lot's wife, but it's not Lot's wife. It's the people who have to look back. They can't start anew. Like I said, it's also the Jewish people when they leave Egypt have a similar problem. But the person who is not able to start new and without looking back, they have the image of the pillar of salt. They cannot evolve because they can't let go of the old self to allow for the new self to emerge. So is preservation good? If you're in the temple, yes, right? If you're bringing an offering to the temple, put salt on because that represents you want to capture and freeze this moment in time, this inspiration, so you can take it home and apply it to your regular life. But we talk about me, when I have to change, when I have to evolve, here, salt is the enemy. And salt is going to keep me stuck in Sodom. So I think that's why, that's the metaphor. The Medrash makes the point that because she sinned with the salt, that's why she turns it to salt. But there's always something.
Why did she sin with the salt?
So the Medrash has this, the story that when Lot invited the guests, she was upset, so he asked her to get the food, and she went and get salt from a neighbor, and she told the neighbor that my husband is inviting guests. That's why I need salt. She wasn't so happy. She wanted the people to come and pressure her husband to get rid of the guests. That's what the Medrash says. But again, salt. Okay, there has to be a deeper. I haven't seen what I just said. I haven't seen anywhere, but I think it's pretty common. It's pretty obvious if you think about the commentary, how she is not able to uproot herself and disconnect herself from the past. And we know what we say about salt. The commentary is explained in regarding to later on in Deuteronomy when the Torah describes the people, the destruction of the land of Israel, where nothing will grow. It says, sulfur and salt, the whole land will be burnt, land of Israel, nothing will grow. Nothing will grow, just like Sodom and Gomorrah. That's what people are going to say when they see the destruction of the land of Israel, and nothing grows. And just like we know, nothing grew in Israel ever since from when the Jews left until the Jews came back. For 1,800 years, nothing grew in Israel. But in any case, what do we see from there? So the commentaries there explain that salt is the opposite of growth, because growth means you have to leave the old and become something new. You put the seed in the ground. It has to germinate and allow for something else. And emotionally, the same thing happens. When I'm moving away from Sodom, it's a painful loss. I'm rotting. My old self is rotting. But you could look at rotting as loss. So you could look at rotting as I'm forced to become something new. And that's a beautiful thing. I can evolve. I'm not stuck in my old ways. I can evolve in something new. If I'm stuck in my ways and I'm not able to become something new because I'm not willing to let go, then I'm salt. Then I'm a pillar of salt. Literally and figuratively. Go ahead. Yeah.
In terms of if Hashem would destroy her, should we destroy her? But she was transformed into something that to me seemed there's some positive connotations there.
Yeah.
Because it was salt.
It could be. I mean, it could be. You're saying the positive, but the positive is the positive is the lesson that we learn from her. When you go down to the Dead Sea in Israel, you see that you see the stones with the salt, and in Israel the tour guides. Unfortunately, now a lot of people are out of work, so it's a big you feel it's hard for them. But in the good old days, we had a lot of jokes about the tour guides. Because basically every rock in Israel, they would make up some story and say, oh, this is where this happened, that's where that happened. There are all kinds of jokes. So for example, they're always coming up with historical facts. So the one joke that they would say, we said when we were in the third grade. So in the Talmud says, oh, there was a story with a guy who did this. So in the Talmud, when the Talmud wants to say there was a John Doe, Hahu Gavra, there was a person. In Aramaic, Hahu Gavra, there was a man. So the joke is that the tour guide is taking the American tourists around Israel and he says, you see this stone? This is exactly where Hahu Gavra was buried. Because it's not a person. Or the other joke was, this is where Samuel 2 was buried, because it's Samuel 1, Samuel 2, 2 books. So Samuel 2 was buried here, but the problem is Samuel 2 is the same guy as Samuel 1. So that's what the jokes. I'm just saying, so when we drove down to the Dead Sea, the tour guide would look at that stone and say, I think this is the stone, this is Lot's wife. This is the salty pillar. This is Lot's wife. So I guess we learn from her. So is it positive? I think that to me, it's the preservation. Is preservation positive? In some contexts, yes. In the context of change, of growth, it's the enemy. The Torah wants to say nothing will grow. It's going to be like sulfur, salt, like Sodom. That's what we say. We read it in Nitzavim, the fourth to last parsha of the Torah. Okay. So the bottom line is, don't be a pillar. Don't be a pillar of salt. Allow for, but for that, it's a painful process. Growth is painful. Growth means I'm leaving my old identity and evolving into something new. She is not able to do it. Okay. Okay, now we have a very troubling story about the daughters of Lot. And it's very hard to, it's a question of the Torah, as always, the Torah doesn't give us, the narrator, the Torah doesn't give us the moral judgment of whether or not what they did was right. It's left to us, it's up to us to guess. It doesn't say so explicitly. Just like with Lot offering his two daughters, we have no idea if it's a good or bad thing. Now with the action of the two daughters, it becomes even more complicated. So the point here is that Lot, I don't want to get into the details here, but Lot runs to first he wanted to, the angel said, run to the mountain. Lot doesn't want to go to the mountain. Why does he want to go to the mountain? Because who lives in the mountain? Abraham lives on the mountain. And he doesn't want to be too close to Abraham. Why? Because he's very righteous in comparison to the people of Sodom. But in comparison to Abraham, he's not righteous at all. So he doesn't want to go. So he asked the angel, could I stay in the city of Tzoar? In this nearby city. The angel says, fine, you could say, I'm not going to destroy. But he's afraid. So he runs to the mountain. Okay? So he's afraid, he runs to the mountain. In the mountain, he's in a cave. And he's in the cave, and here you have the story of the daughters of Lot. They don't know. They say to each other that there's no other man around. Now, the question is, they think the entire world is destroyed or not? We'll get to that in a minute. But we'll read the story. Okay. I'm not covering every verse there. We'll read the story. So let's read verse 30 on page 89 in the stone, the final line. Now Lot went up from Zoar and settled on the mountain, his two daughters with him. For he was afraid to remain in Zoar. It was too close to Sodom, right? There's aftershocks. He was afraid. He dwelt in a cave, he with his two daughters. This is a very sad image. Remember, he was a very wealthy man. He was with Lot. Think about how he left the mountaintop, right? Last parasha, he was with Abraham. And his shepherds were fighting with Abraham's shepherds because they were too close. They had too much possessions to be living next to each other. And then Avram says, let's separate. And Lot separates and goes to Sodom, which is this tremendously wealthy place and fertile place. But Lot, a few years later, emerges from there, and he has nothing. He's living in a cave. In any case, he's there with his two daughters. The older one said to the younger, our father is old, and there is no man in the land to marry us in the usual manner. Come, let us ply our father with wine and lay with him, that we may give life to offsprings through our father. No other men, we have to get him drunk, and we have to bring a child to the world through him. So they plied, I guess that's a word, plied their father with wine on that night. And the older one came and lay with her father. And he was not aware of her lying down and of her getting up. And it was on the next day that the older one said to the younger, behold, I lay with my father last night. Let us ply him with wine tonight as well, and you come and lay with him, what we may give life to offspring, that we may give life to offspring through him, through our father. Verse 35. So they plied their father with wine that night also, and the younger one got up and lay with him, and he was not aware of her lying down and of her getting up. Thus Lot's two daughters conceived from their father. The older bore a son, and she called his name Moab. He is the ancestor of Moab until this day. And the younger one also bore a son, and she called his name Ben-Ami. And he is the ancestor of the children of Amon until this day. So we have two nations that emerged from Lot's daughters and Lot, Moab and Ammon. Who are Moab and Ammon? They're going to appear later in the Torah because they live right outside of Israel. They are descendants of Abraham, really, I guess relatives of Abraham. They're not descendants of Abraham, but they're relatives of Abraham because Lot is Abraham's nephew. So Ammon and Moab are Abraham's great nephews, and they live east of the Jordan. And therefore, when the Jewish people leave Egypt in the book of leave Egypt, and they come close to the land of Israel. So we read in the book of Numbers that the Torah says that we're not allowed to provoke war against Ammon and Moab because they receive their land, because they're descendants of they're related to Abraham. The Torah doesn't say that they're related to Abraham. In other words, that's not the reason given explicitly. It just says this is the Yerusha, this is the inheritance that they get, and therefore we're not allowed to provoke war, and we have to actually go around the countries, and we only conquered the land of Sichon and Og, which is the land of Emori, but not Moab and Ammon. Here you see whom Ammon and Moab are. So years later, when Moshe writes this verse, and he says he's the father of Moab and Ammon till this day, it means this is the lineage of these two nations who are known. And we'll see later they have mitzvot about them. They're not allowed to marry into the Jewish people. It becomes very complicated. So this is a story. This is a story that has ramifications later on in Jewish history, as we will see. But in any case, let's start from let's try to start somewhere. We want to start somewhere in the story, try to dig into the story. The first question is, did they do anything right? What they did, was it right or wrong? So is it right or wrong? So what do they think? They think there's no other man on the earth. They think the entire earth was destroyed. So if that's the case, then even though the act is wrong, but the justification is right. If you look at the Medrash, you will see that there's two opinions. There are two opinions. Some people say it was a great sin. Some people say it was actually the right thing to do. And there's a debate about that. There's an interesting question: is where do they have wine in the cave? Where did they have wine in the cave? So you could say when they left, they grabbed a bottle of wine. Noach leaves Sodom, he grabs a bottle of wine. Torah doesn't say so. The Torah just says that they found wine. So the Medrash that wants to say that what the daughters of Lot did was justified, so they say it was actually a miracle. In other words, God arranged that there should be wine there so two nations could emerge from Lot. That's what the Medrash says. Now,
in order for wine to appear, that is an outright miracle, because wine is something that needs to be created over time. It's fermented grapes.
Yeah, so
it's not something that just appears like a piece of bread could appear. No, it's wheat. It has to be ground.
It doesn't say, to be clear, the Medrash doesn't say that a miracle happened and God came there. The miracle is that they happened to be in the cave where there was wine. Wine, yain nizdamein lahem. Nizdamein means they chanced upon wine. Now, some scholars believe that it's not so uncommon, because where are you going to store the wine? They say it's not so uncommon to store wine in caves. It's a hot region. You may want to store wine in caves. So what we're saying, we're not saying that the fact that wine appears is a miracle, that God sent wine from
someone else had placed the wine there from before,
and they ended up in that cave,
and they discovered it.
Yes. So, but again, Rashi quotes that Medrash and says, "Wow, God prearranged that they should end up in the wine with cave, so two nations should emerge." That sounds like it's a positive. Others say it's a negative, but that's what it is. So we'll take Jill's question and then we'll dig a little further. You can unmute, Jill, if you want to hear you.
Yeah, it's really a comment. What the girls have experienced that their father considers their sexuality negotiable. Now, Lot, it's more likely that he was the perpetrator rather than the victim. Would that have changed the story? If that had been the case, it seems more likely the situation.
Yes. So the rabbis are on your team. They're going to try to go through the story and try to shift some blame to Lot. And so the rabbis are going to do what you're doing. I'm going to follow your path, or you're going to follow their path. If they thought that everyone was destroyed, did Lot think everyone is destroyed? Maybe not. So maybe Lot sees the fear of his daughters, and maybe he doesn't do anything to alleviate the fear. Maybe that's a problem also. Now, if you look at the verse, going back to Jill's point, if you look at verse 33, the verse says, so they plied their father with wine on that night, and the older one came and lay with her father, and he was not aware of her lying down and of her getting up. The verse says he was not aware that she lied and she got up. She lied down and got up. She had no idea. And that's why, and that allows for the next night, they could do the same trick because he was too drunk on the first night. And the verse says you can't argue with the verse, except that you could. In other words, if you look at the Torah scroll in the Hebrew, Rashi points out that the word uvekuma, the word and when she got up and her getting up in the Torah scroll has a dot on top of it. Nakud al vav uvekuma. There is dots. Now the Torah has no vowels and no dots. Only in certain places there's a dot on the word. And the dot on the word is here to draw attention to the word. There's a few places that the Torah does so. One example is when it says Vaishakeu, when Esav kisses Jacob when they meet. So there's actually, that word has dot on every letter. Okay, so there, the purpose of the dot is sort of to weaken what the verse is saying. It's like putting it in quotations. In other words, don't read this so literally. And it appears in the Torah scroll. You don't see it in the English, you see it in the Hebrew, but it's in the Torah scroll. Even the Torah scroll doesn't have any vowels, but the tradition is that on top of this word, uvekuma, when she got up, there's a dot. Says Rashi, what does it mean when she got up? What does it mean? Why is there a dot? Because when she got up, he didn't know. He just made believe he didn't know. Okay, so you see what we're trying to do here. What the sages are trying to do is trying to say that Lot is not as innocent as he sounds. He's not as passive because he knew what happened when she gets up. In other words, at some point he sobers up a little bit, enough to know what's going on. And then the next night, when he does drink wine again, he also, so that obviously that indicates of his moral standing, and it's a negative judgment of him. Going to the two daughters, assuming that, let's assume, we'll take the opinion that we're going to look at them in the positive light, and we'll say that they did the right thing because they, as the verse says, they thought there's no other man on earth. Some people also read it, they say, well, they thought there's no other man that's going to want to marry them because they're from Sodom, right? When it says there's no other man on earth, what does earth mean? Aretz is land. It could mean the entire land, or it could mean in the land of Israel, right? So it's not exactly clear what they think, but the bottom line is they think that if they want, so either they're trying to save the human race, or they're trying to preserve their family, or the people of Sodom, or their culture. So it's not exactly clear, but let's take the simple view that they think that everybody else is destroyed. There's nobody else to preserve humanity, and therefore they have to do this terrible act, but they're doing so for the right cause. Let's assume that's the case. Okay. Even so, Rashi points out that there's a very big difference between the older one and the younger one. And the younger one has much more modesty in the sense she doesn't advertise what happened. And if you look at toward the end of the verse, toward the end of the story, when they name their daughters, look at verse 37. 37 reads, the older bore a son and she called his name Moab. What does Moab mean? Moab, from my father. That's what the word means. In other words, she did the right thing, but it's immodest, but she's not afraid of the immodesty. She was willing to advertise that, yes, he is the son of my father. Whereas the second daughter and the younger one also bore a son, and she called his name Ben Ami. What does Ben Ami mean? It's the same facts. The same facts happen, but she says, he is the son of a member of my tribe. Ami is nation. She is the son of someone in my nation, but she doesn't actually name and say the son of my father. So in that sense, she is much more. She is more modest, and that's positive. So it seems like what the rabbis are saying by pointing this out is that even if you're doing something morally wrong, immoral act for a justified cause, it's still important to figure out why are you doing it? Are you doing it in a way that you're going to be modest about it or not? So in other words, it's also the intention is important, but also your attitude toward the sin is also important. So you have to engage in doing something wrong. Are you happy that you had to, or you want to hide the fact? So that's important also to figure out what the person's subjective attitude toward the immoral act, even if it's a necessary immoral act. So that's what the rabbis point out. I just want to add one thing before we take Vicky's question, is if you actually follow, so that's clear. It's clear in the verses that she, the older one, first of all, the older one is the instigator. She comes up with the idea and she convinces her younger sister. But again, later on, we know in the end of the story that she names her son Moab. So she is letting everyone know that this child is from her father. Whereas the second daughter, Amon, she's just saying he's a son of a member of my nation, member of my tribe. She doesn't really explicitly say that he is from her father. So keeping that in mind, you look back and you could see how the Torah makes slight changes in this narrative that expresses this idea that the younger one was more modest. So here we have a very interesting phenomenon. The same thing happens. So the first night and the second night, the same thing happens, but still the narration, the way the Torah tells the story changes. Why does the way the Torah tell the story change? Because the Torah is sensitive to the intention of the person. So I'm going to give you an example. There are a few examples. I'll give you the most explicit example. So if you look at verse 33, that describes the first night. And then look at verse 35, which describes the second night. So we'll start with 33. Batashkena, verse 33. So they ply their father with wine that night, and the older one came and lay with her father. Okay, the narrator says clear. There's no euphemism. He says clearly, she lay with her father. Okay, that's 33. The second night, 35, verse 35. So they plied their father with wine that night also, and the younger one got up and lay with him. Who's him? Well, we know who him is, but the Torah is not going to say so explicitly. You see, so when the Torah, even though the Torah is describing the same exact act, the Torah knows, the Torah makes a judgment call about, of the two daughters, which one is doing it in a modest way because she feels like there's no choice, but which one is not embarrassed by the act. And that's why it's not just the end by the name, it's the way the Torah tells the story itself. You can already see a difference how the Torah is alluding to this. Now, when you read it quickly, you don't pay attention. If you read it carefully, you see 33 and 35, which are saying the same exact thing. The Torah says it in a different way. In 33, it says explicitly her father. In 35, it says with him, even though we know who the him is, but the Torah is not going to say it explicitly. So that is the story with the two daughters of Lot and the children, and this is sort of the lineage of Sodom ends with Amon and Moab, and in some sense, Amon and Moab are the only survivors of Sodom. So you want to see what becomes of Sodom, you have to look at Amon and Moab. Okay, now let's look at what happened with Amon and Moab. So first of all, there's a lot at stake. Why is there a lot at stake? Because we mentioned before that Mashiach comes from Amon and Moab. Mashiach comes from King David, which comes from Moab, because Ruth comes from Moab. So we have to analyze this. This is a very important story. There was a lot at stake. But first, Vicky wanted to say something.
I had actually three questions. The first is, again, there is no moral judgment in the Torah, but I was just wondering if there is any discussion about which approach is better, the older daughter or the younger daughter, because the first is initiating but being open about it, and the second one, the younger one, is doing that but kind of trying to cover it up, kind of being modest. So which approach is better? That's my first question. The second question is, when they were offered to the mob, did they know about it, if there's any connection to that story? And my third question about the Abraham, because when he was negotiating Sodom and Gomorrah, he obviously knew it's going to be destroyed. So why didn't he warn Lot?
Okay, so let's start with the first one. Is there a difference? Which one is better? It's clear from this that the sages believe that it's better to be modest. And therefore they quote, Rashi quotes this, that when the Torah tells us not to provoke the cities, the nations of Ammon and Moab, the Torah says in a different way. When it comes to Ammon, when it comes to Moab, the Torah says don't go to war against Moab. When it comes to Amon, it says don't even provoke them, which is less than war. Don't even bother them at all. So Rashi makes that point and says, so Moab, they get a reward. In other words, because their culture is going back. In other words, we assume that we assume they inherit the culture from their mother. And in that sense, she was less modest. So the protection they get is a little bit less. The Jews can't go to war with them, but the Jews could provoke them, could cause pain. What's litza'er is to cause some sort of distress, but you can't go to war. With Amon, Rashi says, the verse says, Al titkar bam, don't even provoke them at all. Rashi is quoting the Medrash and the Talmud. So that's clear. The first one is the sages certainly say, even if you believe you have to engage in something that is immoral, certainly you have to be modest. So you have to be modest and not advertise that. Your second question is, do the daughters know? I don't know. There's no reason to, at least the Medrash, well, Jill thinks they did, and I'm not disagreeing with her because the Medrash does make the connection. The Medrash says that because he sacrificed his daughters, the Medrash says, well, the end would be that he will be with them. In other words, the Medrash is drawing the line between those stories. So it's not out of the question to assume that they did know about it, but we don't know for sure. Third point, where's Abraham? So it's not clear what Abraham thought about what's going to happen to Lot, because Abraham is really asking God to preserve the entire cities on behalf of the righteous. And that cannot be done because there's not 10 people. You need 10 people to be able to tip the scale that the righteous should protect the wicked. But we assume that if there's an individual person who is righteous, they will be saved, as was the case with Sodom. I assume that Abraham knew that. Or I would say that it all depends on how Lot himself would treat the guests. In other words, that itself was up to test. When God says, I'm going to descend to see whether or not the people, the cry coming from Sodom is consistent with what's happening in Sodom, meaning this is a test. And whether or not Lot will be saved will be determined not by the nepotism of whether or not he's Abraham's relative, even though there is a verse that implies that, but we'll get to that in a second, but really by Lot's actions himself. Now, which leads us to, before we go to the future of Amon and Moab, it leads us to an interesting verse. If you look back at verse 29, and so it was, chapter, in the stone it's 89, page 89, but it's verse 29 in chapter 19. And so it was, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham. So he sent Lot from amidst the upheaval when he overturned the cities in which Lot had lived. So this verse implies that Lot was saved because God remembered Abraham. In other words, it's sort of a kindness to Abraham. He's being saved because he's Abraham's nephew, not because of his own action of risking his life to invite the guests. So how do I deal with this verse? So some commentaries explain, some people say, yeah, Lot should be punished for living there so many years, living in that wicked society so many years. The fact that he's inviting guests once is not going to save him. We need Abraham's help. We need the merit of Abraham. That's what some commentators say. Others say no. Others say Lot himself is being saved on his own account because he himself invited the guests. So he's worthy of being saved. So why does the verse imply? Why does the verse imply that God had to remember Lot? So they say something interesting. The merit that Lot gets from Abraham is the merit to have his wife and family saved, right? Because what happens is Lot is being saved, but the angels say, take whoever belongs to you, your daughters, your other daughters who were married, who were engaged, your sons-in-law, anyone in the clan can come. Well, they're not deserving. They didn't invite the guests. They didn't protect the guests. They weren't happy that the guests are being invited. At least the other daughters. I'm not sure about these two daughters. So that's what some people say. That's the merit of Abraham, to save not only himself, but to save the entire family. Okay, so now we have to look forward. You want to look forward, and basically, there's a big problem here. The verse says that we may not accept a convert from Ammon and Moab forever, which is very strange, because when it comes to other nations, the Egyptians, we cannot accept a convert for 3 generations.
How do we accept Ruth then?
Very good question.
That's a very basic question. Ruth is
Very good
a
question.
Moabite princess.
Very good question. But let's first read the verse. So you see, I'm not making stuff up. The verse says clearly, it's in the portion of Kitetse. The verse says, if you want to look, it's in the stone. It's on page 1055. Here's the story. Verse 4, and an Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter the congregation of Hashem. Even their 10th generation shall not enter the congregation of Hashem to eternity. In other words, they are not allowed to, you can't accept a convert from Ammon and Moab. Now, if you look later, verse 8, you shall not reject the Edomite. Okay, I'm sorry, verse 8. You shall not reject the Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not reject an Egyptian, for you were a sojourner in his land. Children who are born to them in the 3rd generation may enter the congregation of Hashem. So if you're an Egyptian convert, 3 generations, you could marry a Jewish person. Moabite and Ammonite, you may never marry a Jewish person. That's what the verse says. What's the terrible crime of Ammon and Moab? You ready? Ready for the terrible crime? Let's see the terrible. They have to be worse than the Egyptians, right? The Egyptians, it says that in 3 generations they could marry. 3 generations after they convert, they can marry a Jew. Ammon and Moab must be much worse than the Egyptians, because Ammon and Moab could never marry a Jew. Never enter the Jewish congregation, meaning they never can marry a Jew. So what was so terrible? What was their terrible sin? You ready? Okay. Verse 5. Because of the fact that they did not greet you with bread and water on the road when you were leaving Egypt. One reason, one sin. And because why do we say he? Because now this is a differentiation between Ammon and Moab. The second reason applies only to Moab, not to Ammon. Because he, meaning Moab, hired against you Balaam, son of Beor, of Petor, Aram Naharaim, to curse you. Right? On the end of the 4th book, we read about the story of Balak, the king of Moab. He was afraid of the Jews, so he hires Balaam to curse the Jews. Instead of cursing the Jews, he blesses the Jews. But that's Moab. So Moab can't marry, Ammon can't marry. But what's the greatest sin that applies to both of them? Because they did not greet you with bread and water. Now I ask you a very simple question. What's worse? Enslaving the Jews for 200 years, or not greeting them with bread and water when they pass through you and they pass through Egypt? And here we're saying that because Ammon and Moab did not greet the Jews with bread and water when they passed on the way into the land of Israel, that's why we could never accept their convert ever again. That's a very strange concept. So one thing you could say, well, when your brother doesn't give you bread and water, it's more painful than a stranger enslaving you, right? Ammon and Moab, they're relatives, right? My brother is not nice to me, that's more hurtful. That's one interpretation. But it's still very difficult to say. This is the great sin. They could never convert because they never greeted us with bread and water. So this is the one problem. The other problem we have, a very big problem, as we discussed in the past, this is the problem that Jonathan raised, and that is, what's the story with King David? And in fact, many people thought that King David was illegitimate. Forget about an illegitimate king. He's an illegitimate Jew, because his great-grandmother is Ruth, and Ruth is a Moabite princess and a Moabite convert, and Moabites cannot come into the Jewish people, cannot marry the Jewish people. An explicit verse right here. So what do you do with this? So the Talmud discusses the story. The Talmud discusses the story that there was a debate in David's times himself, and ultimately the rabbinic tradition is as follows. The rabbis, if they need a loophole, they pull one up. No, I'm kidding. They say like this. What the verse says, Lo yavo Ammoni u'Moavi. The verse says an Ammonite or a Moabite, but it says it in the masculine, singular masculine. It doesn't say Moaviyah, which would mean feminine, a woman from Moab. It doesn't say Ammoniyah, a woman from Ammon. It says Ammoni and Moavi. And therefore, they said Ruth is a Moabite, but she's a female. She can convert. What a beautiful interpretation. Except the rabbi said that's ridiculous, because look a little further. Further, it says, Lo yavo Mitzri, an Egyptian shouldn't enter the Jewish people for 3 generations. We don't say Egyptian man is excluded, but Egyptian woman is included, even though it says the same thing. It says Mitzri in the singular masculine form. When it comes to every other example, we don't say it's only male, not female. Only Ammon and Moab, we go out of our way to say, oh, it seems like we're making an exception for Ruth. And we're saying, oh no, it only applies to Moabite male, but not female. All the other examples on this page, we say that the masculine form applies to a woman as well. So the Talmud over there answers and says, okay, I'll tell you what. You have to look at the reason. The Torah says that the reason why they should not be accepted to come into the camp, into the Jewish people, is because they did not greet you with bread and water on the way when you were leaving Egypt. Who makes the policy of whether or not you're going to greet the nation with bread and water. Who makes the policy? Who's, in language of the Talmud, who's accustomed to go greet people with bread and water? It's the men, not the women. That's what the Talmud over there says. Because the Torah gives the reason, so the reason gives you the parameters of the law. So because the women don't make the policy, it's the men that make the policy. If the men make the policy, then the crime of not greeting the Jews with bread and water applies to the men and not to the women, and therefore Ruth is a kosher convert, kosher Jew, and King David is a kosher Jew and kosher king. Wonderful, everybody is happily ever after. We have a big problem here. And to say is what is the like I said, going back to the question of what's so terrible, because they can never convert again because they did not greet you with bread and water. It doesn't seem like such a terrible crime that will justify this result. So the few commentators say this. You could say this in more traditional terms or more contemporary terms, but the concept is like this. The concept is you have to look at Amon and Moab as the product of Sodom, but really the product of the union of Lot and his daughters. And we're going to look at it this way, and we're going to say Lot was morally culpable. He did something wrong. He should have known what's happening. Certainly the second night he should have known. He also didn't alleviate the fear of his daughters. He didn't say it was only us. And in general, Lot is the person who made the choice to move to Sodom. On the other hand, the daughters of Lot did something positive in their mind to create humanity, to preserve humanity. So now there are two conflicting characteristics within Ammon and Moab. Do they take after the people of Sodom, or do they take after their mothers, which was an act of kindness, an act of preservation? So which factor within their personality is dominant? That's the question that the reader, hundreds of years later, we say when we have to deal with Ammon and Moab, what type of people are they? And it, just like with the story of Sodom itself, their actions determine. So too over here. It's not that not bringing bread is what causes us to say we never want to marry you. Even a convert from Ammon and Moab can never join our people. There's no sin with not bringing bread. But if you're not bringing bread, that shows that the dominant characteristic within you is the characteristic of Sodom. And therefore, we don't want to marry you. In other words, to put it in other words, the way the Malbim puts it, to put it in other words, the people of Sodom have no moral merit, zero. The only thing they would have had, Lot himself going to Sodom has no moral merit whatsoever. He's basically saying, I'm leaving Abraham because I want to live the lifestyle of Sodom. So that's something that's the worst. It's worse than almost Egypt, because Egypt has a corrupt philosophy. Lot, the commentaries explain, he believes like what Abraham believes, but he's overtaken by the materialism of Sodom. So we don't want to have anything to do with Lot per se. The only redeeming factor that Lot has is the fact that he has the kindness of Abraham and he invites guests. Oh, that's your only redeeming factor. If you don't have any kindness, you don't show kindness to the Jewish people when you're leaving Egypt, what does that show? That shows that the little influence that you had from Abraham is not dominant in your personality. And now your personality is overtaken by the attribute of Sodom. So it's not that we're not inviting you we don't want to marry you because you didn't give us a piece of bread. It's not the piece of bread. The fact that you didn't give us the piece of bread represents that your culture is a culture of Sodom. Had you brought the bread, then you would say, it's Abraham's influence that is being preserved through you, and therefore we want to marry you. Now, I combined the two. The earlier, more traditional interpretation says we're judging them whether Lot is part of Sodom or Lot has influence from Abraham. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is what I started from is, are these daughters, these nations, are they the children of their father or are they children of their mother? And if they're children of their mother, then we do want to marry them, because then they do have the kindness, because what they did was in their mind, even though the act itself was morally questionable, but the justification was the motivation was justified. Now let's go back to Ruth and to Ruth, the descendant of Moab. The fact that it's not just that we know that, like the Talmud says, the men were the ones who made the decision not to greet the Jews with bread and water. In other words, the men made the decision that not to be kind, but the women were excluded. It's that too, but it's more than that, because when did the sages determine that a Moabite woman could marry the Jewish people? It was determined regarding Ruth. Okay, what do we know about Ruth? When you read the book of Ruth, the Torah keeps emphasizing, the verse keeps emphasizing and highlighting her kindness to her family, to her husband's family, to Naomi, her mother-in-law, and even to the family of her husband, the deceased husband, that she's willing to marry an old man to be able to have children to perpetuate the legacy of her dead husband. So in other words, the Torah keeps mentioning that Ruth is the epitome of kindness. Why do we have to keep highlighting that she's kindness? Because that's what's at stake here. The question here is, are the Moabites, are they like the men turned out to be, unkind? In other words, they're perpetuating the legacy of Sodom, or are they kind because there is a gene in there? There is a gene in there from Abraham, from Lot, or let's start from the daughters of Lot, from Lot, who receives kindness from Abraham. And we're going to say that the daughters of Lot also had this motivation. They were kind, and they also wanted to their act of perpetuating humanity, in their view, was an act of kindness. And therefore, Ruth was the first convert to show up and alert the sages to the idea that no, there is kindness within Moab. And that got the rabbis to understand, to apply. There's a whole thing that the rabbi said it was a tradition. It was a tradition. But the tradition was not made famous until Ruth, because she was the one who you were able to see that the Moabite women were kind because of the kindness she portrayed. And that gets us back to the core of, when you look at Amon and Moab, there's two conflicting character traits. There's the character trait of Sodom and the character trait of the daughters of Lot, which comes from Lot, which is influenced by Abraham. And just like the story of Sodom itself, it's determined, the figuring out how to deal with Sodom is determined by their action. So too with the Amon and Moab, how we relate to them is, and how do we figure out which part of their personality is more dominant, was also determined by their action. The men didn't bring bread and water, as opposed to Ruth, who expresses great kindness to her family. And that's why we differentiate between the men and the women. All we're trying to say here is, I think, in short, is that it's the Torah is going out of its way not to paint with a broad brush, not to say Sodom bad. What we're saying is, it depends. Even in a morally complex situation like Sodom, people emerge from Sodom and we say they are not evil. In other words, they could express their inherent goodness, and they can actually be ultimately the redeemer of the whole world, because Ruth becomes the matriarch of David and all the kings of Israel, including the Mashiach. And even when we look at the action itself of the daughters of Moab, of the daughters of Lot, we're not saying that it is good or bad. We're looking at it in a complex way. So you have to engage in a negative behavior for what you think is a moral purpose. Even so, we're looking carefully and saying, how are you doing it? And what's your attitude toward it? So we're always looking at it with a complexity and not just saying an act is good or bad. We realize that within any act, there could be multiple forces coming together. And hopefully, in some cases, the positive dominates. And that's why within the descendants of Sodom, through Ruth, the positive aspect of Sodom becomes dominant, and ultimately is going to repair the entire world. So this is the story in short: complexity, moral complexity, but that's the world we live in. So that's the story in short. That's the pitch. Okay, everybody should have a wonderful day, and I guess the message is we have to perpetuate the legacy of Abraham, of kindness and goodness, and ultimately.
Also, the idea that through the turning over of evil, we get to the place of goodness.
Yeah,
And that-
ultimate goodness.
and
Yeah,
ultimately, you know, that is what the Messianic dream is about, which is we're redeeming that evil and turning it over. And that's where Mashiach comes from, that place where there's just a tiny little bit of good.
right.
But a lot of evil, and out of that tiny little bit of good comes Ruth.
Yeah, so I didn't elaborate upon it last week as much as I wanted to, but the notion that the most intense evil could become the most intense good, right? Because according to the Kabbalah, we talked about it in the breaking of the vessels, Sodom was the most terrible place. Yes, from Sodom comes the perfection of the entire world, because energy is neutral and the vessels shatter. So the energy, the most intense energy, expresses itself in a negative form in Sodom. But if you can get in there and you could extract the energy of Sodom, the energy that they bring to evil, and if you could rectify that, then the intensity of that evil could actually be an intensity that will actually bring intense goodness to the entire world.
Which is the concept of a Baal Tshuva.
Concept about tshuva, but even more basic in the Kabbalistic terminology, it's the olam hatikun, the world of rectification, where we take the shattered sparks of the world of chaos and we channel it in an orderly fashion. So when you see something that's intensely evil, you could look at it as intensely evil that needs destruction, as Sodom needed destruction. But there's this, don't forget that there's a spark from Sodom that needs to be redeemed. And even if the way it's redeemed doesn't look so kosher, right? How do we perpetuate Sodom? Through an act of that is immoral according to the standards of the Torah, right? Even for the Gentiles, incest. Really, that's what's happening here. But make no mistake, within the evil, there is potential for transformation and ultimate, not only transformation, but intense transformation. And ultimately, Mashiach comes about through the rectification of the intense energy of Sodom. So you look at the world from the Kabbalistic view, it's not good and bad. It's very hard it's not good and bad. Bad means that there's intense sparks of holiness that fell very low. So what do you need to do? You need to break the expression of this evil, the negative expression, but you have to get to the core. And the core of that energy is holiness, and the core of that energy can be elevated. And that comes from the Kabbalah of the Ari, which introduced the concept of the shattering of the vessels, which according to some scholars actually is very interesting. I don't want to get into it now because I'm not an expert in this, but according to some scholars actually allows, Gershom Shalom says this, actually allowed for Shabtai Tzvi, because Shabtai Tzvi, the idea was that, if there are sparks of holiness in evil, then the evil becomes kosher. And that's why you can do things against the Torah and you can convert, because there's no problem, because there's evil, because there's holiness in the evil. But that was a mistake with the understanding of the Arizal, and the Hasidic movement sort of rectifies it again. We're not saying that the evil is good. We're saying that the evil has to be destroyed. But the inner energy, just like Sodom, has to be destroyed. But the inner energy of the evil, the energy itself, is still could be extracted and elevated, and has to be.
Finally, one other thing is that it's certainly known by some scholars that the only way for Mashiach to enter this world is not through a direct channel, but is through a backdoor methodology.
Yes, that's the
whereby, if Mashiach were to come in the front door into this world, he would be rebuffed by many different prosecuting angels.
Yes.
And his soul wouldn't be allowed to come down into this world. Hence, there has to be a backdoor entry whereby through this evil or shell, the Mashiach can enter.
Yes.
And so we see that in the story
of Ruth. And if you look at the story of Ruth, you have three problematic unions. Ruth comes to Boaz in the middle of the night in an immodest fashion. Boaz, a descendant of Judah, a descendant of Peretz, Judah's son, who comes from the union of Judah and Tamar, who he thinks is a harlot. Okay, that's from the father's side. And from the mother's side is Ruth, who comes from Moab, who's Lot's daughters. So any way you look at that union, there's so many ways to look at it as negative. But ultimately, that's where the energy that's going to correct the world comes from. Okay, this is very deep, very profound, very Kabbalistic.
Rabbi, I'm not certain, but
yes.
I think that the word ruthless, the etymology of the word ruthless is somebody whose attributes are the antithesis of
Interesting. So Ruth represents the kindness.
Ruthless, not having attributes of Ruth.
So Ruth is the kindness. Beautiful.
I think, I'm gonna check. it out.
Okay, okay. Yes, go ahead.
So I have a different perspective on this, because if you follow the lineage and the history, maybe the message from what we're reading is saying that maybe immorality, as we perceive it, wasn't so bad after all.
Well, if that's the case, so you're right. When you hear what I'm saying, you can get to that conclusion. And that's what I alluded to. Some people made that mistake. And that's the danger of the Kabbalah, because you study the Kabbalah, you could say, well, so the immorality really has intense holiness. So let's all engage in immorality.
Right.
Right. So that's not what we're saying. And that's why you have to be very careful when you study Kabbalah. You have to be grounded in the law and Jewish tradition. What we're saying is we're not saying we're going to celebrate Sodom. We're saying we're going to destroy Sodom. In other words, we have to destroy the external manifestation of evil, because that is evil. But what we're saying here is that evil itself possesses potential to be transformed. And where do you see that? We see that in this union. Now, this union, how is this not evil? Because under those circumstances, with the information they had, that's what they had to do. So, but the point here is that's the danger. Like I mentioned, that's the danger of the Kabbalah, because the Kabbalah says, wow, intense evil has really intense holiness. Okay, wonderful. So let's all go bank robbing. Be wonderful, right? But we're not saying that. We're saying that the core of the energy, because it has the divine root, is good. The problem is now it fell down, it shattered. Now it's actually going to harm you. You think about the metaphor of the shattered vessel. You have a beautiful chandelier. If it crashes on the floor, now those particles are glass. They're going to cut your fingers or cut your toes. So in other words, now it's harmful. But if you can actually reconstruct it together and bring it back to its source, now it will give light again. And not just give light again, but the light that will give will be more intense. So that's why you have to study the Kabbalistic concepts. You have to study them carefully. And that's the mistake. And like I said, I'm no expert on this, but people, Gershom Shalom, I think his big thesis is that Shabtai Tzvi is a corruption of the teachings of the Arizal. And it's rectified by the Hasidic movement. But I think that's what he says.
Thank you. Have a great day, Rabbi. Thank you.
Wonderful day, everybody. Take care. Meet each other in good health next week, God willing, in good health.
Amen.
Yasher Koach, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you.